The blue light from my phone illuminated the darkness of our bedroom as I stared numbly at the banking alert. 3:42 a.m. $537,000 transferred from our joint savings to Cannon Beach Realty. I read it 3 times, my stomach sinking with each confirmation that the money was actually gone. Our entire savings, meant for our future, for the children we'd planned to have, vanished with a single transaction that I hadn't authorized. If this story resonates with you, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's story might just change how you think about relationships forever. I scrolled through our account history with trembling fingers, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Daniel had been making smaller withdrawals for months, $5,000 here, $8,000 there, culminating in this massive transfer that had triggered my alert settings. The same alert settings my husband had insisted were unnecessary and paranoid. The soft glow of my laptop screen provided the only light in my home office as I pulled up the property listing I'd discovered in Daniel's browsing history days earlier. A stunning beachfront cottage in Cannon Beach, modern cedar and glass perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific. The exact property he'd casually mentioned was a good investment opportunity last month. Now I knew exactly who he was investing in, and it certainly wasn't his wife of 8 years. My wedding ring caught the light as I typed, a bitter reminder of vows that clearly meant more to me than to him. I'd noticed the signs for months: late nights at the office, new cologne, mysterious weekend conferences. But I'd trusted him, believing our relationship was strong enough to weather whatever midlife crisis he was experiencing. Now the truth glared at me from my screen. My husband had emptied our joint savings to buy a love nest for himself and whoever had captured his wandering attention. What Daniel didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn in 8 years of marriage, was that the quiet, supportive wife he took for granted had resources of her own. Resources that would make his betrayal not just painful, but catastrophically expensive. I opened another browser window and logged into Pacific Northwest Trust with credentials Daniel had no knowledge of. The trust fund my grandmother had established for me decades ago had grown steadily under Michael Rodriguez's expert management. While Daniel boasted about his investment acumen at dinner parties, dismissing my financial opinions as cute, I'd been quietly growing my inheritance into a substantial fortune. The same fortune that now owned 67% of Riverdale Financial Group, my husband's employer. Still working, sweetheart? Daniel's voice from the doorway made me jump. I closed the banking app with practiced ease, my heart pounding as I swiveled to face him. Just checking some numbers for the charity auction, I replied, the lie falling easily from my lips after years of maintaining my financial privacy. The auction for Portland Children's Hospital was coming up, an event Daniel considered just another excuse for you to play society wife while he handled the real money. He leaned against the doorframe in his designer pajamas, hair perfectly tousled even at this hour. Don't stay up too late. You know how you get when you're overtired. His tone carried that familiar condescension that had once hurt, but now merely fueled my resolve. Big day tomorrow? I asked casually, watching his reaction. Huge merger discussion. Could mean a serious promotion. He straightened, preening slightly. Don't wait up tomorrow night. These negotiations always run late. I nodded, my face a mask of wifely understanding. The Riverdale-Westmont merger? Sounds exciting. It's complicated business stuff, he said with a dismissive wave. Nothing you need to worry your pretty head about. If he hadn't been so self-absorbed, he might have noticed my smile didn't reach my eyes. What Daniel didn't know was that I'd had lunch with Westmont's CEO last week. There would be no merger, at least not the one Daniel anticipated. Westmont had already agreed to be acquired by West Coast Ventures, the holding company where my trust fund held majority control. As Daniel returned to bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Michael. All documentation prepared. Board meeting. Confirmed for tomorrow at 2 p.m. Will he be there? Wouldn't miss it, I replied. He thinks he's presenting the merger proposal. I closed my laptop and moved to the window, looking out at the Portland skyline glittering against the night sky. For 8 years, I'd allowed Daniel to believe I was nothing more than a trophy wife whose greatest achievements were organizing charity events and looking decorative at his side. 8 years of him explaining basic financial concepts to me. Concepts I'd mastered during my MBA at Wharton, the degree he believed was just something to keep you busy before we met. My phone lit up again, this time with a text from my best friend Lisa. He's with her again. 3rd floor conference room. Jessica from marketing. They've been in there for over an hour with the blinds closed. I didn't need the confirmation to know he was cheating. The evidence had been mounting for months. Unexplained charges at hotels I'd never visited. Late nights that produced no actual work results. The growing emotional distance. But now I had a name. Jessica Parker. The new marketing director Daniel had hired personally, overriding HR's recommendations for more qualified candidates. Morning arrived with painful brightness. I dressed carefully in the conservative outfit Daniel preferred me to wear to his business functions, a navy Burberry dress that concealed more than it revealed. The perfect costume for the supportive, slightly dim wife he believed me to be. "You look nice," Daniel commented absently, adjusting his Rolex, a gift from me for our 5th anniversary, purchased with the quarterly dividends from my trust's investments. "The board members' wives will be at the reception afterwards. You'll have plenty to talk about with them, charity things and whatnot." I sipped my coffee, swallowing both the bitter liquid and the more bitter retort that threatened to escape. "The merger must be going well. You seem confident." "It's practically a done deal," he said, straightening his tie. Another gift from me. "Once we absorb Westmont's client portfolio, Riverdale will be unstoppable. I'm thinking of buying a boat to celebrate. Maybe we can sail it up to that new property investment I've been considering." The audacity nearly took my breath away. He was planning to buy a boat with what he thought was his money to celebrate a merger that would never happen, presumably to sail to the beach house he'd just purchased for his girlfriend with our joint savings. My phone buzzed with a message from Michael. "Documents signed, SEC filings complete, announcement scheduled for 2:30 p.m. "You know," I said, touching Daniel's arm in a gesture that had become mechanical over the years, "I think I'll join you for the board meeting today. It would be nice to understand more about what you do." Daniel's surprise quickly morphed into condescending approval. "That's my girl, showing interest in the business world. Don't worry if it goes over your head. Just smile and nod. The board members like seeing supportive wives." If he hadn't been so self-absorbed, he might have noticed the calculated gleam in my eyes or questioned why his normally busy with charity work wife suddenly wanted to attend a high-level financial meeting. But Daniel saw exactly what he expected to see. The decorative, slightly vapid spouse whose greatest concern was planning the next fundraiser. I checked my appearance one last time before we left, ensuring I looked exactly like the woman Daniel thought he'd married, pleasant, unthreatening, and utterly under his control. The woman he'd felt comfortable betraying, both emotionally and financially. The woman who would never, ever notice $500,000 missing from their joint account. The Portland skyline provided a dramatic backdrop through the floor-to-ceiling. Windows of Riverdale Financial's top-floor conference room. Board members were already gathering, accepting coffee from assistants and reviewing presentation materials. Daniel moved through the room with practiced confidence, shaking hands and making introductions. "And this is my wife, Emma," he said, his hand proprietarily at my waist as he presented me to the chairman. "She wanted to see what all the fuss is about with this merger business." "Mrs. Mitchell," the chairman nodded politely, though I caught the slight questioning look he directed at Daniel. Spouses didn't typically attend high-level merger discussions. "I hope I won't be in the way," I said with a self-deprecating smile. "I promise to be quiet as a mouse." "Not at all," the chairman replied. Always good to have fresh perspectives. Daniel guided me to a seat along the wall, away from the main conference table. Just watch from here, sweetheart. The actual discussion might be a bit technical for you. I nodded agreeably, settling into the chair as Daniel took his place at the table, spreading his presentation materials with flourish. His confidence was almost admirable, the perfect picture of a man who believed he controlled not just his own destiny, but everyone else's in the room. At precisely 2:15, the boardroom doors opened again. Michael Rodriguez entered, followed by 3 executives I knew well from West Coast Ventures. Daniel's expression flickered with confusion as the newcomers were shown to seats at the head of the table. "What's Rodriguez doing here?" he whispered to his colleague. "He's just some wealth manager." The chairman called the meeting to order, his expression carefully neutral.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Before we discuss the proposed Westmont merger, we have some organizational announcements. I'd like to introduce Michael Rodriguez, representing Pacific Northwest Trust and West Coast Ventures. Michael stepped forward, nodding professionally, to the room. Thank you, Chairman Davis. As some of you may already know, over the past 5 years, Pacific Northwest Trust has been systematically acquiring shares in Riverdale Financial Group on behalf of our primary client. As of this morning, that position represents a 67% controlling interest in the company. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Board members whispered urgently to each other while Daniel sat frozen, his presentation forgotten before him. "This is impossible," he finally sputtered. "There's been no public acquisition. I would have known about this." "The acquisitions were all properly filed with the SEC," Michael continued calmly. "Made through various investment vehicles, all perfectly legal and transparent. The board has been aware of this position for some time." Daniel's head whipped around to stare at the chairman, who nodded in confirmation. "Now, regarding the Westmont situation," Michael continued, "there will indeed be a merger, but not the one Mr. Mitchell has been proposing. Westmont Financial has already agreed to be acquired by West Coast Ventures, which will then integrate both Westmont and Riverdale under a new management structure." The color drained from Daniel's face as he struggled to process this information. His career-making merger had evaporated, along with the promotion and bonus he'd undoubtedly been counting on. The bonus that would have replaced the savings he'd emptied for Jessica's beach house. "Who?" Daniel demanded, finding his voice. "Who's behind Pacific Northwest Trust? Who's been buying up Riverdale shares?" Michael turned toward me, and for the first time, everyone in the room followed his gaze to where I sat quietly against the wall. "Perhaps," Michael suggested with professional courtesy, "Mrs. Mitchell would like to explain." I stood from my chair against the wall, smoothing down my navy Burberry dress as every head in the boardroom turned toward me. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to Daniel's usual dominance of any room. For once, my husband seemed at a complete loss for words, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice steady and confident, a tone Daniel had never heard from me before. "As Mr. Rodriguez indicated, I am the primary client of Pacific Northwest Trust and the majority shareholder of Riverdale Financial Group through West Coast Ventures." I moved toward the conference table with measured steps, years of carefully constructed submissiveness falling away with each click of my heels against the polished floor. Daniel's eyes widened as I approached, truly seeing me perhaps for the first time in our marriage. "Emma," he managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" "This," I replied, taking the seat at the head of the table that Michael had pulled out for me, "is business, Daniel. Something you've spent 8 years telling me I couldn't possibly understand." Chairman Davis cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mitchell has been the controlling interest in Riverdale for nearly 3 years. Her financial expertise has been invaluable to this board, though she preferred to remain a silent partner until today." Daniel's face contorted with confusion and the first flickers of alarm. "This is insane. Emma runs charity auctions. She plans dinner parties." "Actually," Michael interjected, sliding a folder across the table, "Mrs. Mitchell holds an MBA from Wharton, specializing in investment strategy. Before your marriage, she managed a significant portion of Pacific Northwest Trust's portfolio, with remarkable results. She continued that work privately throughout your marriage." The look of betrayal on Daniel's face would have been comical if it weren't so deeply ironic. "You've been lying to me for 8 years?" "I preferred to think of it as maintaining my financial independence," I corrected him calmly. "Something that has proven rather prescient, wouldn't you agree?" The implications of my words clearly hadn't fully registered yet. Daniel was still processing the professional humiliation, not yet connecting it to his personal betrayal. That realization was coming, and I watched his face with clinical detachment, waiting for the moment when all the pieces clicked into place. "As I was saying," Michael continued smoothly, "given the recent acquisition of Westmont by West Coast Ventures, we'll be implementing a new management structure effective immediately. The details are in the packets being distributed now." Assistants moved around the table, placing leather portfolios in front of each board member. Daniel stared at his copy without opening it, his complexion growing paler by the second. "You'll notice," I added, nodding toward the unopened portfolios, "that there are significant leadership changes outlined in Section 3. Most notably, Daniel Mitchell is being removed as head of acquisitions, effective immediately." That finally broke through his shock. "You're firing me? Your own husband?" "Not exactly firing," I clarified. "Merely reassigning, given certain financial irregularities we've discovered. The board felt it prudent to move you to a position with less fiscal responsibility." Michael tapped a key on his laptop, and the large screen at the end of the boardroom illuminated with financial records. Specifically, the history of transfers from our joint account to various recipients, culminating in yesterday's massive withdrawal. "These records," Michael explained to the increasingly uncomfortable board members, "show systematic misappropriation of joint marital funds. Most concerning is yesterday's transfer of $537,000 to purchase a property in Cannon Beach, a transaction made without Mrs. Mitchell's knowledge or consent, despite these being jointly held assets." Daniel's expression shifted from shock to fear as he finally began to understand the full scope of what was happening. "That was our money," he protested weakly. "Our savings." "Indeed," I agreed. "Money that came primarily from my trust fund. Dividends, which I deposited into our joint account. Dividends from the same trust that now controls your employment future." I nodded to one of the assistants, who distributed additional documents, printouts of text messages between Daniel and Jessica Parker, discussing the beach house, planning weekends there, along with explicit conversations that left nothing to the imagination. "For those wondering about the ethical implications," I continued, "these messages were sent on company devices, making them company property and subject to review when financial improprieties were suspected. Ms. Parker has already been informed that her services will no longer be required at Riverdale." The boardroom had grown uncomfortably quiet, several members shifting in their seats or loosening their ties. No one made eye contact with Daniel, whose flush of humiliation had spread from his face down his neck, disappearing beneath his starched collar. "Emma," he tried again, his voice cracking slightly. "This is between us, our marriage. It doesn't belong in a boardroom." "On the contrary," I replied coolly, "when you used our joint savings, built primarily from my investments, to purchase property for your girlfriend, you made it a financial issue. When you conducted your affair using company resources and during company time, you made it a business issue. The board has every right to be concerned about both the ethical breach and the questionable judgment displayed." Chairman Davis cleared his throat again. In light of these revelations, the board supports Mrs. Mitchell's recommendation for immediate reassignment. Mr. Mitchell will be transferred to our Seattle office as a junior analyst, reporting to the regional compliance team. Seattle? Daniel sputtered. You're sending me to Seattle? My life is here in Portland. Your employment is in Portland, I corrected him. And that employment is now conditioned on your acceptance of this transfer. The alternative, given the documented misuse of company resources and time, would be termination for cause. The weight of this reality finally seemed to hit Daniel fully. His career at Riverdale, the identity he'd wrapped himself in so completely that he believed it entitled him to disregard his marriage vows, was effectively over. The prestigious position he'd used to impress Jessica Parker was gone. The future he'd been planning with her, in the beach house purchased with our savings, had evaporated in less than 20 minutes. The beach house, he said finally, a desperate edge to his voice. I signed the papers yesterday. The money's already been transferred. Yes, I nodded. To Cannon Beach Realty, the same realty company that's owned by a subsidiary of West Coast Ventures. The transaction has been frozen pending review for potential fraud, given that you attempted to use jointly held marital assets without proper authorization. Daniel's shoulders slumped as the last of his confidence drained away. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've had time to prepare, I acknowledged. 8 years of being underestimated provides considerable opportunity for planning. Michael slid another document across the table, a settlement agreement outlining the terms of our separation. Mrs. Mitchell is offering reasonable terms, all things considered. You'll retain your position with the company, albeit at a reduced level and different location. You'll receive a modest settlement that acknowledges your contributions to the marriage. In exchange, you'll relinquish all claims to the joint accounts, the Portland residence, and naturally, any interest in her trust holdings. Daniel stared at the document without touching it. And if I refuse? Then, I said softly, we proceed. With a contested divorce where all of this becomes public record, the affair, the financial misconduct, the attempted misappropriation of joint assets. Your prospects for future employment in financial services would be limited. The board members watched this exchange with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a car crash, unable to look away yet deeply regretting their front row seats. Chairman Davis finally stood, signaling an end to the excruciating scene. I believe we should recess for 30 minutes to allow Mr. Mitchell time to review these documents privately, he suggested diplomatically. When we reconvene, we can address the actual business of the Westmont integration. The board members couldn't leave the room fast enough, each avoiding eye contact with Daniel as they filed out. Soon, only Daniel, Michael, and I remained in the cavernous boardroom, the Portland skyline a dramatic backdrop to our marital implosion. I trusted you, Daniel said finally, staring at me as though seeing a stranger. The irony of his statement nearly made me laugh. And I trusted you, I replied evenly. I trusted you with my heart, my future, and $500,000 in joint savings. You betrayed that trust on every level. It wasn't like that, he protested weakly. Jessica and I, it just happened. The beach house was an investment. An investment you plan to enjoy with your girlfriend, I cut him off. Please don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. The text messages make your intentions perfectly clear. Daniel slumped back in his chair, the full weight of his situation finally sinking in. Everything's gone, he murmured. My job, our savings, the beach house. Not everything, I corrected him. You still have your position with the company, albeit in Seattle. You still have the settlement offer, which is more generous than many would recommend under the circumstances. And you still have Jessica, assuming her interest survives the dramatic downgrade in your financial and professional status. His bitter laugh suggested he harbored no such illusions about Jessica's loyalty. You've had this power all along? The whole time we've been married? You've been what? Secretly running companies while pretending to plan charity events? I wasn't pretending to plan charity events, I explained, surprised by how important this distinction felt. I genuinely care about the Children's Hospital and the other organizations I support. I simply also maintained my financial interests and education, despite your persistent dismissal of my capabilities. Michael, who had been silently observing our exchange, checked his watch. Emma, the Westmont team will be arriving in 15 minutes. Should I have them delay? No need, I replied, gathering my notes. Daniel and I have said all that needs saying. I turned back to my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband. You have 24 hours to consider the settlement offer. After that, the terms become significantly less favorable. As I stood to leave, Daniel made one last desperate attempt. Emma, please. We can work this out. I made a mistake with Jessica. I see that now. But 8 years of marriage has to count for something. I paused, studying the man I had once loved enough to promise forever. It did count for something, Daniel. It taught me exactly who you are. A man who would steal from his wife to fund his affair, who would lie to my face night after night, who would dismiss my intelligence while benefiting from my generosity. The money, he tried, grasping at straws. I can pay it back. I'll sell my car, my watches. It was never about the money, I interrupted. It was about respect, something you never gave me, even before Jessica entered the picture. The beach house fund was just the final confirmation of what I already knew, that you saw me as nothing more than a decorative accessory to your life, useful for planning parties and warming your bed, but never as an equal partner. I gathered my portfolio and nodded to Michael, who held the door for me. The Seattle office will expect you on Monday. Your temporary housing details are included in the relocation package. I suggest you start packing. As I walked out of the boardroom, leaving Daniel staring blankly at the settlement agreement, I felt none of the satisfaction I had anticipated during the long months of planning. Instead, I felt a profound weariness mingled with an unexpected sense of liberation. The weight of pretending to be less than I was, of dumbing down my vocabulary, of swallowing my opinions, of hiding my accomplishments, lifted with each step. In the elevator down to my waiting car, Michael finally broke his professional silence. Are you all right? I will be, I assured him, watching the floor numbers descend. It's been a long time coming. The beach house? He asked. Do you want to keep it or sell it? I considered this as we reached the lobby. Donate it, I decided, to the Children's Hospital as a retreat for families with kids in long-term treatment. Something good should come from all this. Outside, Portland's perpetual mist had given way to actual rain, the droplets catching the mid-afternoon light in momentary prisms before disappearing into puddles. My driver held an umbrella as I slid into the back seat of the town car. Through the tinted windows, I watched the Riverdale Financial Headquarters recede, the glass tower where Daniel had built his identity while I had quietly built my empire. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. How did it go? Are you okay? It's done, I typed back. Meeting you at the Nines in 20 minutes. Order me something strong. As the car navigated downtown Portland's rain-slicked streets, I found myself thinking not about Daniel or Jessica or even the beach house, but about my grandmother. Eleanor Wilson had established my trust fund with explicit instructions that I should always maintain financial independence no matter what. A woman with her own money makes choices based on desire, not desperation, she'd told me when I turned 18. I'd nodded politely then, not fully understanding the wisdom or the warning in her words. Now, watching the city pass by outside my window, I silently thanked her for the foresight that had protected me when my heart had failed to do so. The trust fund hadn't just preserved my financial security, it had given me the freedom to end a marriage that had slowly been eroding my sense of self-worth, year by condescending year. The next chapter was entirely mine to write, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't need to pretend to be anything less than exactly who I was. A woman who understood both charity auctions and corporate acquisitions, who could plan a perfect dinner party and orchestrate a complex financial strategy, who would never again allow anyone to make her feel small for being completely, unapologetically herself. The Nines Hotel's rooftop bar offered a panoramic view of Portland, the city lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky as evening approached. Lisa was already waiting at our usual corner table, 2 martinis positioned before her. Her expression brightened when she spotted me, then immediately shifted to concern as I approached. "You look exhausted," she observed, pushing one of the glasses toward me as I slid into the velvet chair opposite her. Cathartic exhausted? Or devastating exhausted? I considered this as I took my first sip, the gin burning pleasantly down my throat. Somewhere in between, like finishing a marathon I've been training for in secret. Lisa studied me with the careful attention of someone who had witnessed the slow deterioration of my marriage from the beginning. Unlike Daniel, she had never underestimated me, had, in fact, been one of the few people who knew about my continued involvement with Pacific Northwest Trust and West Coast Ventures. "How did he take it?" she asked finally. "About as expected," I replied, swirling the olive in my glass. "Shock, denial, bargaining. He hasn't reached anger yet, but I'm sure it's coming. Probably tonight after he's had a few drinks and fully processes what happened." "And Jessica?" "Terminated. Both from Riverdale and, I suspect, from Daniel's life once she realizes the beach house is gone and his career is essentially over in Portland." Lisa raised her glass in a small toast. "To consequences." I clinked my glass against hers, though with less enthusiasm than she might have expected. "To consequences," I echoed quietly. "You don't seem as satisfied as I thought you'd be," Lisa observed. "Having second thoughts?" I shook my head, watching the city below as people hurried through the early evening, umbrellas bobbing like colorful mushrooms along the wet sidewalks. "Not second thoughts. Just..." I expected to feel triumphant, I guess. Instead, I mostly feel tired. 8 years is a long time to pretend to be someone you're not. 8 years is a long time to be married to someone who doesn't see your value, Lisa countered. "What he did with the beach house, with your money, that was the last straw, but it wasn't the real problem." "No," I agreed. "The problem started long before Jessica. It started when I let Daniel believe I was exactly what he wanted. Decorative, unthreatening, slightly vapid, the perfect corporate wife who would never challenge his sense of superiority." "Why did you?" Lisa asked the question that had lingered between us for years. "Let him believe that, I mean. The Emma Mitchell I knew in college would have never tolerated being talked down to like that." I considered her question seriously, having asked myself the same thing countless times over the years. At first, it was easier. Daniel was so clearly intimidated by accomplished women. You saw how he reacted when we first met, when I mentioned my MBA. Remember how he kept interrupting to clarify basic financial concepts I obviously already understood? Lisa rolled her eyes. God, yes. I wanted to stab him with my cocktail fork. So I started simplifying my language around him, letting him explain things, boosting his ego. It seemed harmless then. We were just dating, and I thought he'd eventually become secure enough to handle the real me. I took another sip of my martini, the ice clinking softly against the glass. But then we got engaged, and it became our dynamic. The more I pretended to need his explanations, the more he seemed to need me to need them. "And your work? The trust management?" That was grandmother's stipulation when she set up the trust. I had to remain actively involved in its management. So I compartmentalized. Emma at home planned charity events and nodded appreciatively at Daniel's business stories. Emma at the Pacific Northwest Trust offices made investment decisions and evaluated acquisitions. And never the twain shall meet, Lisa murmured. Until today. Until today, I confirmed. My phone buzzed on the table, a text from Michael, with an update on the Westmont integration meeting. I silenced it without replying. Business could wait until tomorrow. What happens now? Lisa asked, signaling the server for another round. With the house, I mean. Will you stay there? I hadn't fully decided yet. The West Hills house held 8 years of memories, some genuinely happy, despite everything that had transpired since. I'm not sure. It feels too big for just me, but also, it's yours. Lisa finished my thought. You paid for most of it. You designed the renovations. You shouldn't have to be the one to leave. Maybe, I conceded. But starting. Fresh somewhere new has its appeal too. Our conversation paused as the server delivered fresh drinks. When he departed, Lisa leaned forward conspirationally. So when exactly did you realize Daniel was using your joint savings to buy property? For Jessica? And how did you find out it was her specifically? The property transfer itself was yesterday. That's what triggered the banking alert. But I've suspected something was happening with the accounts for months. Small withdrawals that Daniel couldn't adequately explain when I asked casually. As for Jessica, I pulled out my phone and showed Lisa the surveillance photos my private investigator had provided weeks earlier. I hired someone after I found the first jewelry store receipt. Davis Investigations. They're discreet and thorough. Lisa scrolled through the images. Daniel and Jessica entering a hotel, sharing intimate dinners, walking hand in hand through Washington Park. The classic cliché, she muttered. The boss and his marketing director. Could he be any more predictable? That's partly why I didn't confront him immediately, I admitted. The sheer unoriginality of it was almost more insulting than the betrayal itself. The young, attractive subordinate hanging on his every word, validating his ego in ways his increasingly independent wife wouldn't. It was like watching a midlife crisis instructional video. So you waited until he did something truly stupid, Lisa concluded, handing back my phone. I waited until he crossed a line that couldn't be explained away or minimized, I corrected her. Emotional affairs can be denied forever. Financial betrayal of this magnitude created the leverage I needed for a clean break. As we sipped our second round of martinis, I found myself relaxing for the first time in months. The constant vigilance, checking, bank statements, monitoring Daniel's movements, maintaining my dual identity, had taken a toll I hadn't fully recognized until now, when it was finally over. Have you told your parents yet? Lisa asked. I shook my head. Tomorrow. Mom never liked Daniel much anyway, said he reminded her of Dad before their divorce. Too charming by half. She wasn't wrong, Lisa observed. Though your father at least had the decency not to steal your mother's money when he left. Small mercies, I agreed dryly. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Daniel. I silenced it immediately, watching as it lit up again seconds later with another attempt. He's reached the anger stage, I noted, showing Lisa the screen as it continued to vibrate with incoming calls and messages. Are you going to answer? Not tonight, I decided, powering off the device completely. Whatever he has to say can wait until he's sober and I've had a full night's sleep. Lisa raised an eyebrow. You think he's drinking? I know he is. It's what Daniel does when his world doesn't conform to his expectations. He drinks expensive Scotch and makes grand pronouncements about how unfair everything is. I finished my martini and set the glass down with finality. I've watched that particular show enough times to know I'm not missing anything new. As the evening progressed, our conversation drifted away from Daniel and toward the future. My plans for West Coast Ventures, the Children's Hospital fundraiser I was still determined to chair next month, the possibility of traveling now that I no longer needed to maintain my careful facade. You could finally take that Southeast Asia trip we talked about in college, Lisa suggested, her eyes brightening at the idea. No more pretending you can't tell a stock option from a stock pot. That's tempting, I admitted. Though there's something to be said for staying and showing Portland exactly who Emma Mitchell really is. The financial powerhouse who's been hiding in plain sight all these years? Something like that, I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. Though I think I'll still plan charity events. I genuinely enjoy them, despite Daniel's dismissal of anything that doesn't generate profit. By the time we left the Nines, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the streetlights. Lisa's Uber arrived first, and she hugged me tightly before departing. "Call me tomorrow," she instructed. "And Emma, I'm proud of you. What you did today took incredible courage." I smiled at her assessment, though courage didn't quite feel like the right word. Necessity, perhaps. Self-preservation. The natural conclusion to years of diminishment and disrespect, catalyzed by the final betrayal of our joint savings. My own car arrived moments later, the driver professional and silent as we wound through Portland's evening traffic toward the West Hills. I kept my phone powered off, unwilling to deal with Daniel's inevitable barrage of messages and calls until I'd had time to process the day's events myself. The house was dark when we pulled into the circular driveway, no sign of Daniel's Range Rover. I'd half expected him to be waiting, ready to continue the confrontation that had begun in the boardroom, but the empty garage and silent rooms suggested he'd sought refuge elsewhere. With Jessica, perhaps, though I doubted she'd be particularly receptive now that his golden future had tarnished so dramatically. I moved through the quiet house, turning on lights and shedding the navy Burberry dress that now felt like a costume from a role I'd finally stopped playing. In the master bathroom, I washed away the carefully applied makeup that had completed my corporate wife disguise, studying my bare face in the mirror afterward. The woman who stared back looked tired but resolute, older than she had at 28 when she'd walked down the aisle with Daniel, believing his admiration would eventually evolve into true partnership and respect. The intervening years had added fine lines around her eyes and a certain guardedness that hadn't been there before, but also a strength forged through quiet resilience and strategic patience. I changed into comfortable loungewear and made my way to the kitchen, suddenly aware that I hadn't eaten since a hasty breakfast before the board meeting. The refrigerator offered little inspiration. We'd been scheduled for our usual Friday dinner at Paley's place, a standing reservation that had clearly been forgotten in the day's dramatics. As I assembled a simple meal of cheese, crackers, and fruit, I found myself wondering what Daniel was doing at that moment. Raging to friends who would suddenly find themselves conflicted about loyalties? Drowning his sorrows at the Arlington Club bar? Desperately trying to salvage things with Jessica by promising that somehow, someday, he'd reclaim his position and provide the lifestyle she'd been promised? The latter seemed most likely. Daniel's ego wouldn't allow him to admit defeat so easily, especially to a woman he'd spent years underestimating. He would be formulating explanations, justifications, promises, anything to maintain the image he'd created of himself as the successful, powerful man undone by his calculating, deceptive wife. I carried my impromptu dinner to the back terrace, where the covered seating area offered protection from the lingering mist while providing a view of the city below. The lights of downtown Portland twinkled through the trees, creating the illusion of stars fallen to earth. In the distance, the Willamette River reflected the city's glow, a dark ribbon threaded with shimmers of gold. My grandmother had loved this view. When I'd first brought her to see the house before purchasing it, she'd stood on this very terrace and declared it a proper thinking spot. She'd been right, as she was about most things. I'd made many of my best investment decisions sitting here, watching the city while Daniel believed I was simply enjoying the scenery. The irony of our marriage hadn't escaped me over the years, that Daniel, with all his posturing about financial acumen, had never questioned the source of our comfortable lifestyle. My trust fund dividends had funded the house renovation, the luxury cars, the expensive watches he collected, the lavish vacations to destinations that always mysteriously aligned with locations where I had business interests to check on. He'd attributed our prosperity to his own brilliance, never once wondering how a mid-level executive at Riverdale Financial could afford such luxuries. His ego had made him both arrogant and incurious, a combination that had allowed me to maintain my separate financial identity while playing the role of admiring wife. As I sat contemplating the city and my future within it, my thoughts were interrupted by the harsh sound of tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the terrace as a vehicle pulled into the driveway below. Not Daniel's Range Rover, but a taxi, from which my husband emerged, clearly unsteady on his feet. I remained where I was, listening as he fumbled with his keys at the front door, eventually managing to enter the house. His movements were not those of the polished financial executive he portrayed to the world, but of a man drowning in the consequences of his own actions, seeking something solid to cling to. "Emma?" His voice called from inside, alternating between anger and pleading. "I know you're here. Your car's outside." I didn't respond, continuing to sit quietly on the terrace, my dinner forgotten on the small table beside me. His footsteps traced an uneven path through the house, growing louder as he approached the back doors. "There you are," he said when he finally spotted me. The scent of expensive scotch preceded him onto the terrace, confirming my earlier prediction. "Been ignoring my calls?" "I turned my phone off," I replied evenly. "It seemed better to continue our discussion when you were sober." He laughed bitterly, dropping heavily into the chair across from me. "Sober. Right. Like anyone would stay sober after what you pulled today." "What I pulled?" I repeated, my voice deliberately calm. Interesting characterization of events. Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his typical perfectionism abandoned in the face of crisis. "You humiliated me in front of the entire board, destroyed my career, threatened to take everything we've built together." "Everything we've built together," I echoed, noting his selective memory. "Like the beach house you purchased for Jessica." "With our joint savings? Was that something we built together, Daniel?" Daniel flinched at the mention of Jessica and the beach house, his momentary bravado deflating. He stared out at the Portland skyline, jaw working as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't further incriminate him. "It wasn't what you think," he finally muttered, the familiar phrase falling flat between us. "What exactly do you imagine I think it was?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Because the evidence suggests my husband emptied our joint savings account to purchase property for another woman. Property he discussed with her extensively via text messages on his company phone, planning weekends and holidays there together." Daniel's gaze dropped to his hands, his wedding ring catching the subtle landscape lighting of our terrace. "The beach house was an investment opportunity. Jessica helped identify it." "And your plans to christen every room during your anniversary weekend? Was that also an investment strategy?" I kept my tone clinical, detached, though the memory of reading those particular messages still stung. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "You read my private conversations. On your company device, which you signed an agreement acknowledging could be monitored. During an investigation into financial improprieties that you initiated by transferring $500,000 without authorization." I took a sip of water, maintaining eye contact. "The real question isn't why I read them, Daniel. It's why you wrote them." He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the terrace with agitated steps. "This marriage has been dead for years, Emma. You know that as well as I do. Always busy with your charity work, barely present even when you're home." The irony of his accusation might have made me laugh if the situation weren't so painful. My charitable activities had taken perhaps 10 hours of my week, a fraction of the time I'd spent managing West Coast ventures and the trust's investments. The real absence in our marriage had been my authentic self, hidden away to protect Daniel's fragile ego. If you felt that way, you could have asked for a divorce, I pointed out. Instead, you chose to steal our savings and begin a new life, while maintaining the benefits of this one. He spun around, pointing an accusatory finger. And you've been living a complete lie. Secret companies? Hidden investments? You've been manipulating me from day one, playing some kind of bizarre long game. Managing my inheritance isn't manipulation, Daniel. Neither is continuing my career discreetly when it became clear you couldn't handle a wife who understood finance better than you did. That's not... he began, then stopped, recognizing the futility of denial. You should have told me. I tried, in the beginning. Remember our honeymoon in Bali? When I suggested some adjustments to your retirement portfolio and you spent 20 minutes explaining mutual funds to me as though I were a child? Or our first anniversary when you dismissed my concerns about Riverdale's acquisition strategy as cute? Daniel had the grace to look uncomfortable, though whether from recognition of his past condescension or simply the predicament he now found himself in, I couldn't tell. So instead of communicating like an adult, you created this elaborate deception, he countered, reaching for the moral high ground despite the absurdity of his position, pretending to be some simple housewife while secretly buying up my company. I never set out to acquire Riverdale specifically, I clarified. That happened organically as West Coast Ventures expanded its financial services portfolio. The fact that you worked there was coincidental. Coincidental? He repeated skeptically. Nothing about you is coincidental, Emma. I see that now. An uncomfortable silence settled between us, broken only by the distant sounds of the city below, and the occasional drop of condensation from the terrace cover. Daniel finally sank back into his chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. What happens now? He asked, his earlier anger giving way to resignation. That depends on you, I replied. The settlement offer stands. Relocation to Seattle, modest financial provision, clean break. Sign it, and we both move forward. And if I don't? Then we proceed with a contested divorce where everything becomes public. The affair, the beach house purchase, the financial misconduct. Your professional reputation in Portland would be unsalvageable. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on knees, head bowed. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've had years to consider contingencies, I acknowledged, though I had hoped never to need them. He looked up sharply. You make it sound like you expected me to fail you from the beginning. Not expected, Daniel. Prepared for. There's a difference. I paused, considering whether to share the full truth, then decided complete honesty was overdue. My grandmother taught me to hope for the best in relationships, but plan for the worst. She lived by that philosophy after my grandfather emptied their accounts and disappeared in 1975. Understanding dawned in his eyes. That's why she established your trust the way she did, controlled solely by you. I nodded. She rebuilt her life from nothing at 45, vowed her daughter and granddaughter would never face the same vulnerability. So I've been measured against a ghost from the beginning, he said bitterly, predetermined to fall short. No, Daniel. You were given my trust despite her warnings. The measuring was entirely your own doing. He fell silent again, his gaze drifting back to the city lights. The scotch was wearing off, leaving him with the beginning edges of what promised to be a monumental hangover, both literally and figuratively, come. Morning, I never meant to hurt you, he finally said, the words sounding hollow even to him. Yes, you did, I corrected gently. Not at first, perhaps. But by the time you were transferring our savings to buy Jessica a beach house, you knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't expect consequences. Daniel had no response to this truth, and we sat in silence as the night deepened around us. Part of me, a small, stubborn part that remembered why I'd fallen in love with him originally, wanted to reach across the space between us, to offer comfort despite everything. But that impulse belonged to the Emma who had diminished herself, to soothe his insecurities, and I was no longer that woman. "I should go," he said eventually, making no move to leave. "Where?" He shrugged, a gesture so uncharacteristic of the polished executive he usually portrayed. "Hotel, I guess. Jessica isn't available." The diplomatic phrasing nearly made me smile. Of course, Jessica wasn't available. The promising young marketing director with expensive tastes had signed on for a successful executive with a bright future, not a disgraced financier being shipped off to a junior position in Seattle. "You can stay in the guest room tonight," I offered, my tone making it clear this was a temporary arrangement. "Your things will need to be moved by the end of the weekend." Daniel nodded, accepting this small mercy with uncharacteristic humility. "Emma," he began hesitantly, "did you ever love me? Really love me, not just whatever this has been?" The question caught me off guard, its rawness penetrating the careful detachment I'd maintained throughout our confrontation. I considered deflecting, offering a diplomatic non-answer, but decided he deserved at least this much truth. "Yes," I said quietly. "I loved you deeply at the beginning, enough to believe you would eventually see me, the real me, and value what you saw. By the time I accepted that would never happen, we'd built a life I wasn't ready to dismantle without cause. And now you have cause," he concluded. "Now I have cause," I agreed. He stood, swaying slightly as the effects of the alcohol reasserted themselves. "For what it's worth, I did love you too. Still do, in my way." "Your way was never enough," I replied, not unkindly. "For either of us, it seems." Daniel made his way inside without further comment, leaving me alone with the night sky and the remains of my forgotten dinner. In the distance, a ferry's lights moved slowly across the river, carrying late-night passengers between the city's shores. Its steady, predetermined path seemed an apt metaphor for where we found ourselves, moving inexorably towards separate destinations that had perhaps been inevitable all along. I remained on the terrace long after the sounds of Daniel settling into the guest room had faded, contemplating the strange mixture of emotions coursing through me. Relief predominated. Relief that the charade was finally over, that I could integrate the compartmentalized aspects of my life into a coherent whole. But underneath that relief ran currents of grief for what might have been, anger at the years of diminishment, and an unexpected sense of liberation that made my skin tingle despite the cool night air. When I finally went inside, the house felt different, as though the confrontation had altered its very atmosphere. Rooms that had witnessed years of careful performance now stood ready to accommodate a new reality where pretense was no longer necessary. I moved through them with a growing awareness that soon, very soon, they would be solely mine to reimagine. Sleep proved elusive that night, my mind racing with practical considerations and deeper reflections. The mechanics of disentanglement, financial, legal, social, would be complex but manageable. The emotional terrain felt less certain, mapped, with landmarks I'd avoided examining too closely during my years of strategic patience. The first light of dawn was filtering through the bedroom curtains when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I'd turned it back on before bed, half expecting a barrage of messages from Daniel that never materialized. Instead, the screen showed Michael's name. "I know it's early," he said when I answered, his voice apologetic. "But there's something you should see." "What is it?" I asked, instantly alert. Daniel attempted to access the Riverdale financial systems remotely at 3 a.m., tried to initiate several large transfers from operational accounts. I sat up fully, sleep forgotten. "To where?" "An offshore account in the Caymans. Same one he's been filtering smaller amounts to over the past year." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, yet somehow the blatant attempted theft, mere hours after being confronted with his previous misdeeds, struck me as breathtakingly audacious. Was he successful, I asked, already calculating the potential damage. No, Michael assured me. Security protocols flagged the attempts immediately. All access has been revoked pending further action. Has he been notified? Not yet. We wanted your direction first, given the personal complications. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing this new betrayal. Any lingering ambivalence about my course of action evaporated in the face of such calculated desperation. Inform security to lock down all his accounts and access points, I instructed. Contact Chairman Davis immediately. I want an emergency board call at 9 a.m. to formalize Daniel's termination for cause. And the police? Michael asked carefully. I considered the implications, the public spectacle, the inevitable media attention, the humiliation that would extend beyond Daniel to touch everyone connected to him. Not yet, I decided. Secure the evidence. Have legal prepare the necessary documentation. We'll determine next steps after the board call. After hanging up, I sat motionless at the edge of the bed, processing this latest development. I'd offered Daniel a dignified exit, relocation rather than termination, financial security albeit reduced, the chance to rebuild his career away from the immediate scandal. His response had been to attempt grand theft in the middle of the night. The bedroom door opened suddenly, revealing Daniel fully dressed in yesterday's rumpled suit, travel bag in hand. His expression shifted from determination to wariness when he saw me awake, phone still in hand. Going somewhere? I asked, my voice cold. Early flight to Seattle, he replied too quickly. Thought I'd get a head start on finding an apartment. The lie hung between us, its transparency almost insulting. I stood slowly, maintaining eye contact as I moved to block the doorway. The Caymans have lovely weather this time of year, I observed. Though I imagine it's less appealing when you're fleeing financial crimes charges. His face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about. 3:17 a.m., Daniel. Multiple attempted transfers from Riverdale operational accounts to Golden Horizon Holdings. Your offshore safety net that you've been constructing for over a year. You're monitoring my computer now? He demanded, indignation a poor mask for panic. Riverdale's security system monitors all unusual access attempts. Your name is simply on a very short list of people whose activities require immediate notification. His grip tightened on the travel bag. It's not what you think. It rarely is with you, I agreed, making no move to step aside. The settlement offer is rescinded. The board is meeting at 9 a.m. to terminate your employment for cause. You can't do that, he protested, desperation edging into his voice. The Seattle position was contingent on your accepting the settlement terms in good faith, I interrupted. Attempting to steal company funds hours after being confronted about financial misconduct demonstrates remarkably bad faith. Wouldn't you agree? Daniel's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely, revealing the cornered, desperate man beneath. What do you expect me to do? You've taken everything, my job, my future, the beach house. I needed something to start over with. Something that wasn't yours, I pointed out. Just like our savings weren't yours to spend on Jessica, and just like my trust dividends weren't yours to live on all these years while dismissing my financial acumen. I was entitled to compensation, he exploded, the last vestiges of control evaporating. 8 years of playing the perfect husband to a woman living a complete lie. Looking the other way when you disappeared for charity meetings that went on for days. Pretending not to notice when you took calls in other languages you claimed not to speak. I absorbed his outburst calmly, noting the revealing admissions embedded within. He had known, perhaps not the specifics, but enough to sense the inconsistencies in my carefully constructed persona. Yet rather than confront them directly, he'd chosen resentment, entitlement, and eventually betrayal. If you felt deceived, you could have asked for a divorce at any time, I reminded him. Instead, you chose to steal, to cheat, and when caught, to steal again. Easy judgment from someone who's been living a double life, he scoffed. At least, I was honest about who I was. Were you? I challenged. The devoted husband building a future with his wife while texting his girlfriend about their beach house? The financial expert whose lifestyle mysteriously exceeded his salary? The mentor who took credit for his subordinate's work? Which part exactly reflects your honesty, Daniel? Daniel's face contorted with fury and desperation, the carefully cultivated mask of professional confidence completely gone. He took a step toward me, his body language shifting from defensive to aggressive. "Get out of my way, Emma," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "I'm leaving, and you're not stopping me." I held my ground, meeting his gaze steadily. "The authorities have already been alerted to the attempted transfers, Daniel. Your accounts are frozen, and security is looking for you. Running will only make everything worse." His eyes darted to the bedroom window, calculating, then back to me. "You're bluffing. There hasn't been time." "Automated security protocols don't require time," I explained calmly. "The moment you attempted to access restricted financial systems outside authorized hours, alarms were triggered. The system is designed to protect the company from exactly this type of situation." The truth of my words registered in his expression, the last threads of his desperate plan unraveling before my eyes. His shoulders slumped, and he dropped his travel bag to the floor with a dull thud. "What happens now?" he asked, defeat evident in every line of his body. "Now we wait for the board's decision," I replied, stepping aside to allow him passage from the bedroom. "I suggest you use the time to contact a lawyer." Daniel moved past me without further comment, the fight draining from him as quickly as it had erupted. I followed at a distance, watching as he made his way downstairs to the kitchen, where he filled a glass with water from the refrigerator dispenser and swallowed 2 aspirin from the bottle we kept in a drawer. "The headache's only beginning," I observed, leaning against the doorframe. "Financial crimes investigations tend to be thorough and prolonged." He glanced up sharply. "Is that what you want? To see me in prison?" The question gave me pause. What did I want, beyond the immediate satisfaction of accountability? The man before me, disheveled, desperate, diminished, bore little resemblance to the confident executive I'd married, or even the calculating adulterer who'd purchased a beach house for his girlfriend. This Daniel seemed almost pitiable, though. I reminded myself that desperation often masquerades as remorse when consequences loom. "What I want," I said carefully, "is proportional justice. The board will decide whether to pursue criminal charges based on the severity and extent of the financial misconduct. That decision will be influenced by your cooperation from this point forward." "Cooperation," he repeated bitterly. "You mean complete surrender." "I mean honest accounting of all misappropriated funds, full disclosure of any offshore accounts, and acceptance of the professional consequences of your actions." Daniel drained his water glass and set it in the sink with deliberate precision. "And if I provide this honest accounting, what exactly do I salvage from the wreckage?" "Potentially, your freedom," I replied frankly, "depending on the amounts. Involved in the board's discretion, this could remain a civil rather than criminal matter." He laughed without humor. "My freedom, how generous. Meanwhile, you keep the house, the company control, all our assets, and the satisfaction of having orchestrated my complete destruction." "I orchestrated nothing, Daniel. I protected myself from exactly the scenario that unfolded. A husband, willing to empty our joint savings for his own purposes. Everything that's happened since has been the natural consequence of your actions, not my planning." Daniel sank onto one of the kitchen bar stools, rubbing his temples. "Do you know what the worst part is? Not losing the money or even the job. It's realizing that for 8 years, I've been living with a stranger. someone calculating my destruction while smiling across the dinner table. That's a convenient narrative, I observed. It absolves you of responsibility by casting me as the villain. The reality is much simpler. I maintained financial independence while playing the role you clearly preferred. Had you never betrayed that role by stealing our savings, we might have continued indefinitely as we were. Living a lie, he said flatly. Living the reality you created and preferred, I corrected. You chose the version of me you wanted, decorative, admiring, unthreatening to your ego. I simply adapted to your preference while protecting my interests. Before Daniel could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Michael. I stepped into the hallway to answer, keeping one eye on Daniel through the kitchen doorway. Emma, Chairman Davis has convened an emergency executive committee for 8 a.m. instead of waiting for the full board, Michael reported. They're requesting your presence, along with Daniel's if he's available. He's here, I confirmed. We'll both attend. After ending the call, I returned to the kitchen to find Daniel staring blankly at his wedding ring, twisting it absently around his finger. The executive committee is meeting at 8, I informed him. We're both expected to attend. He looked up, his expression unreadable. To formalize my professional execution? To determine appropriate next steps regarding the attempted financial transfers and your continued employment. Daniel checked his watch, an Audemars Piguet I'd given him for his 40th birthday, paid for with proceeds from a particularly successful investment in pharmaceutical ventures. That's in 90 minutes. Barely time to shower and change. Your appearance should be the least of your concerns right now, I noted dryly. Nevertheless, he stood and headed toward the guest room, pausing at the doorway. Should I pack my things while I'm at it? Or will you have them shipped to whatever prison cell awaits me? I ignored the melodrama. Focus on the meeting, Daniel. Your future depends on how you handle the next few hours. While he showered and changed, I prepared for the meeting with methodical efficiency, reviewing the security reports Michael had forwarded and assembling documentation of Daniel's previous financial irregularities. The attempted transfers were substantial, nearly $2. $3 million distributed across 3 separate transactions, all directed to the same Cayman Islands account that had received smaller sums over the preceding months. The pattern suggested premeditation, rather than panic, a calculated exit strategy that had likely been in development well before I confronted him about the beach house. This wasn't an impulsive response to being caught. It was the acceleration of an existing plan to abscond with company funds. By the time Daniel emerged from the guest room, I was dressed and ready, my professional armor firmly in place. He'd managed to transform himself back into a semblance of the polished executive, though his eyes remained haunted, his complexion gray beneath his careful grooming. Your car or mine? He asked with forced casualness, as though we were headed to a dinner party rather than what might well be his professional execution. Mine, I replied, gathering my portfolio and car keys. I don't think you should be driving in your current state. He didn't argue, following me silently to the garage, where my Audi waited. The drive downtown proceeded in tense silence, Portland's morning traffic providing a mundane backdrop to the extraordinary circumstances unfolding between us. Rain had started again, a steady drizzle that blurred the city beyond the windshield and seemed to mute even the usual cacophony of horns and engines. Did you ever plan to tell me? Daniel asked suddenly as we waited at a traffic light. About your companies, your real financial position? Or was I meant to remain in the dark indefinitely? I considered the question seriously, having asked myself the same thing many times over the years. I tried to show you glimpses of my financial knowledge early in our marriage. Your reaction made it clear you weren't interested in a wife who might challenge your expertise. So, instead of addressing it directly, you built this elaborate deception. I built a parallel life that allowed you to maintain your preferred illusion while protecting my interests, I clarified. Had you ever shown genuine interest in who I really was, had you asked thoughtful questions about my opinions rather than talking over me, things might have evolved differently. The light changed, and I accelerated smoothly through the intersection, navigating toward the Riverdale financial headquarters that dominated the downtown skyline. That's a convenient justification, Daniel muttered. As is blaming me for your current predicament, I countered. We both made choices, Daniel. The difference is that mine harmed no one, while yours have potentially criminal implications. We lapsed back into silence as I pulled into the executive parking garage beneath the Riverdale building. The security guard's expression remained professionally neutral as he waved us through, though I caught the subtle widening of his eyes at seeing Daniel in the passenger seat of my car. In the elevator ascending to the executive floor, Daniel straightened his tie and squared his shoulders, armor of his own going up as we approached the confrontation ahead. I found myself studying him with a clinical detachment, this man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, whose secrets and lies had finally rendered him a stranger. Whatever happens in there, he said quietly as the elevator neared our floor. I want you to know I never intended things to end this way. Few people plan for the consequences of their actions, I replied. That doesn't make those consequences any less deserved. The executive committee was already assembled when we entered the boardroom. Chairman Davis, 3 senior board members, Riverdale's legal counsel, and Michael, whose presence as representative of Pacific Northwest Trust was entirely appropriate given the circumstances. All conversation ceased as we entered, 7 pairs of eyes tracking our progress to the seats left empty at the opposite end of the table. Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Mitchell, Chairman Davis began formally. Thank you for joining us on such short notice. As you're aware, serious allegations of financial impropriety have emerged that require immediate attention. Daniel said nothing, his gaze fixed on the polished surface of the conference table. I nodded acknowledgement, but remained equally silent, allowing the process to unfold according to corporate protocol. Mr. Rodriguez has provided documentation of attempted unauthorized transfers from Riverdale operational accounts, the chairman continued, nodding toward Michael. These attempts occurred at 3:17 a.m., 3:22 a.m., and 3:26 a.m. this morning, originating from an IP address matching your home network, Mr. Mitchell. Daniel cleared his throat. I can explain. Please do, Chairman Davis replied, leaning back, slightly, his expression carefully neutral. I was reviewing company finances, Daniel began, his usual confidence noticeably absent. Given yesterday's revelations about the ownership structure and my own uncertain position, I wanted to ensure certain investment strategies I'd implemented were properly documented. The explanation was so transparently false that a ripple of discomfort passed through the assembled executives. Even Riverdale's legal counsel, Patricia Winters, couldn't completely suppress her wince at the feeble attempt. Investment strategies, Chairman Davis repeated slowly, requiring middle-of-the-night transfers to an offshore account that has received multiple smaller transfers over the past 14 months. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The timing was, admittedly, unusual. I couldn't sleep after yesterday's events and decided to use the time productively. By attempting to transfer $3 million to Golden Horizon Holdings in the Cayman Islands, Michael stated flatly, sliding printed documentation across the table. The same entity that has received approximately $475,000 in smaller transfers since January of last year. The room fell silent as the full scope of the financial misconduct became clear. Daniel's shoulders slumped infinitesimally, the last vestiges of his defense crumbling beneath the weight of evidence. Mr. Mitchell, Patricia Winters interjected, her tone professionally detached. Given the documentation before us, I must advise you that continued denials will only complicate your position. At this juncture, cooperation and full disclosure represent your best course of action. Daniel looked up finally, his gaze moving from face to face around the table before settling on me. Something shifted in his expression. Resignation, perhaps, or simply the recognition that his carefully constructed life had collapsed beyond salvaging. The transfers were exactly what they appear to be, he admitted quietly. An attempt to secure funds before potential termination could restrict my access. The offshore account was established last year as insurance. Insurance against what, precisely? Chairman Davis asked. Daniel hesitated, glancing at me again before responding. Against discovery of other financial irregularities that might impact my position and compensation, such as the beach house purchase using joint marital assets, Michael suggested. Among other things, Daniel acknowledged, his voice barely audible. Chairman Davis exchanged glances with the other committee members, a silent communication passing between them. Mr. Mitchell, given your admission and the evidence before us, this committee has no choice but to terminate your employment with Riverdale Financial Group, effective immediately, the chairman stated formally. Security will escort you to collect personal items from your office, after which your credentials and access will be permanently revoked. Daniel nodded numbly, accepting the inevitable. Furthermore, Chairman Davis continued, we must determine whether to pursue criminal charges regarding the attempted theft and previous transfers. That decision will depend largely on your willingness to provide complete disclosure of all financial improprieties during your tenure, including any additional accounts or assets derived from misappropriated funds. And if I cooperate fully? Daniel asked, his voice steadier now that the worst had happened. Patricia Winters leaned forward. Full cooperation, including restitution of all misappropriated funds, would significantly influence the board's decision regarding criminal referrals. While I cannot promise specific outcomes, transparency and remediation typically factor heavily in such determinations. Daniel turned to me, his expression a complex mixture of defeat, resentment, and something approaching realization. And what does my wife recommend? Prison or mercy? All eyes shifted to me, the room's atmosphere charging with heightened tension. My response would carry significant weight, both professionally as controlling shareholder and personally as the spouse most directly affected by Daniel's betrayal. I studied Daniel's face. This man I'd shared 8 years of my life with, whose ambition and ego had driven him to betray both our marriage and his professional obligations. The easy path would be vengeance, pushing for maximum penalties to match the depth of his deception. But vengeance had never been my goal, only protection and, eventually, justice. Full restitution and complete transparency, I stated firmly, addressing the board rather than Daniel directly. If those conditions are met satisfactorily, I believe civil penalties would be appropriate. Criminal prosecution should remain a contingency only if cooperation proves inadequate. Relief washed visibly across Daniel's features, though it was tempered by wariness, perhaps suspicion about my motives or disbelief that I wouldn't pursue the harshest possible outcome. Mrs. Mitchell's recommendation carries significant weight, Chairman Davis acknowledged. Provided Mr. Mitchell delivers comprehensive disclosure and full financial remediation, this committee is inclined to handle the matter internally rather than involving authorities. Patricia Winters opened her leather portfolio. I've prepared documentation outlining the cooperation requirements and financial recovery process. Mr. Mitchell will need to provide complete access to all accounts, detailed accounting of all misappropriated funds, and signed acknowledgement of his actions. Daniel accepted the documents with trembling hands, scanning the first page briefly before looking up. And my personal situation? The divorce? Is entirely separate from this proceeding, I replied evenly, though your cooperation here will naturally influence settlement discussions. The meeting concluded with formal signatures establishing Daniel's termination and the conditions of the financial investigation. As security personnel appeared to escort him to his office, Daniel paused beside my chair. "Why?" he asked quietly, genuine confusion in his voice. "After everything, why show mercy?" I met his gaze directly. "Because punishment isn't my purpose. Accountability is." He nodded slowly, absorbing this distinction. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for getting caught, but for everything." "I know," I responded simply. Whether his remorse was genuine or merely circumstantial hardly mattered now. Our paths were irrevocably diverging, 8 years of shared history dissolving in the wake of betrayal and revelation. As Daniel was led away by security, Chairman Davis approached, his expression thoughtful. "An extraordinary situation, handled with remarkable composure. The board appreciates your measured approach, Mrs. Mitchell." "Emma, please," I corrected him gently. "And composure has been my constant companion for years. Today is no exception." The remaining proceedings moved with efficient precision. Daniel's office was secured, his digital access terminated, and his personal belongings inventoried and boxed. I remained in the boardroom with Michael, reviewing next steps for both Riverdale's operations and the broader implications for West Coast Ventures. "The Westmont integration can proceed on schedule," Michael confirmed. "Their leadership has been briefed on today's developments and remain committed to the acquisition." I nodded, mentally shifting from the personal earthquake of the morning to the business landscape beyond. "Schedule the announcement for Monday. Let's give the weekend for any immediate fallout to settle." By mid-afternoon, the initial crisis had been contained. Daniel had provided preliminary account information and signed all required documents before being escorted from the building. His expression as he departed, a mixture of shock, humiliation, and dawning comprehension, would likely stay with me for years to come. I declined Michael's offer to accompany me home, preferring the solitude of my own thoughts during the drive back to my house in the West Hills. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath breaking clouds, sunlight illuminating, rain-slicked streets and glistening foliage. The house stood silent and empty when I arrived, Daniel's presence already fading from its spaces like morning mist burning off under the strengthening sun. I moved through the rooms slowly, seeing them with new eyes, no longer stages for the careful performance of our marriage, but canvases awaiting reinvention. In Daniel's closet, hangers stood half empty where he'd hastily packed during the night. His dresser drawers remained partially open, evidence of hurried selection rather than methodical packing. The abandoned items told their own story. Older, sweaters left behind in favor of designer pieces, comfortable loungewear sacrificed for image-maintaining formal wear. Even in crisis, appearance had guided his choices. I found myself in my home office, the space that had always been exclusively mine, where Daniel rarely ventured. Here, among my carefully organized files and elegant furnishings, I had maintained my connection to the financial world he believed beyond my comprehension. The irony struck me freshly, how he had dismissed this room as my charity command center, while I conducted million-dollar negotiations from its confines. On my desk stood a single-framed photograph, Daniel and me on our wedding day, both smiling with the genuine optimism of beginnings. I studied our younger selves, wondering when exactly the subtle shift had occurred, when his admiration had calcified into condescension, when my accommodation had transformed into strategic patience. There had been no single moment of change, only the gradual erosion of mutual respect beneath the steady current of his ego and my acquiescence. I placed the photograph in a drawer, not from lingering pain, but from recognition that this chapter had closed definitively. The future stretched before me with possibilities that had been unimaginable yesterday. The freedom to integrate my compartmentalized selves, to move through professional spaces as my authentic self, to perhaps someday build a relationship founded on genuine partnership rather than performance. My grandmother's wisdom echoed in my thoughts as I settled into my desk chair, opening my laptop to review West Coast Ventures' latest acquisition prospects. Financial independence hadn't just protected me from Daniel's betrayal, it had preserved my essential self through years of playing a role that grew increasingly distant from who I truly was. The trust fund hadn't just secured my material future, it had purchased the most valuable commodity of all: choice. The choice to leave on my terms, the choice to reveal my strengths at the moment of my choosing, the choice to determine the consequences of betrayal according to justice rather than vindictiveness. As evening settled over Portland, I stood at my terrace overlooking the city lights coming alive beneath the darkening sky. For the first time in 8 years, I allowed myself to simply exist. Neither the diminished wife Daniel had preferred, nor the secret executive managing investments from the shadows, but simply Emma, complete and undivided. The path forward would bring challenges, legal proceedings, social recalibrations, professional adjustments as my dual identities merged into public knowledge. But beneath these practicalities ran a current of profound liberation. The trust fund Daniel had forgotten about hadn't just protected my assets. It had preserved the woman I had always been, waiting for the right moment to emerge whole and undiminished. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.